Welcome to Asia Pacific Defense Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. There have been some recent disturbing developments on the international scene, and top of the list by far, for me, is once again US President Donald Trump selling out Ukraine. Now, this is a breaking story. It's possible that the situation will be different in 24 hours from now. But rather surprisingly, at the end of last week, Donald Trump confirmed the existence of a 28-point plan, so-called peace plan, that appears to have been drafted in Russia, that basically gives Russia everything that it has always wanted with the conflict. It basically, you can find it online, but it basically amounts to a Ukraine surrender. All of the meaningful concessions in the document are at the expense of Ukraine. Russia doesn't have to give up anything of any significance. And to pile on the pressure, Donald Trump, although he might be wavering a little bit on this, says that Ukraine has to say yes or no by Thanksgiving, which is Thursday US time, Friday our time, or from the US point of view, everything is off. Now, what that might mean in a practical sense is harder to work out because the US no longer donates military equipment to Ukraine. Anyone who believes that that is the case doesn't understand the facts. The situation now is European countries are permitted to purchase US hardware and in turn donate that to Ukraine, but nothing is coming directly from the US. The US could cut off intelligence sharing, and that would be painful, but there are workarounds for that. I felt there was also a disgusting commercial twist in this so-called deal, with the US wanting to be paid for any security guarantees and also for a slice of reconstruction funds to go to the US, presumably to companies aligned with the corrupt Donald Trump and Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Now, I also have to say that Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has very strangely characterized the situation as a choice between loss of dignity or loss of a friend. Now, I hope that's a mistranslation from the Ukrainian language because, frankly, President Zelensky, no one really cares about your dignity. And if a peace agreement requires you to dress up as a circus clown and dance a jig, then that's just something you are going to have to do. But this proposed agreement actually has nothing to do with Ukraine's dignity. It requires the country to give Russia everything it wants. Basically, it would be the end of Ukraine as a sovereign nation. It would immediately have to hand over all of the strategically vital Donbass region, commit its military to no more than 600,000 people, and also would involve a two-way commitment from both Ukraine and NATO that membership of that organization will be banned in perpetuity. How is it possible that the Trump administration can swing so wildly from hinting that long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles could be donated, this is about a fortnight ago, to now this new position of giving Ukraine another ultimatum, either agree to Russia's terms or we're pulling the plug on you? My best guess is that Russia is now in serious economic trouble. I've mentioned this before. It's getting worse. The Russian financial system is shaky. Bankruptcies are on the rise. Inflation is high. Interest rates are high. The whole thing is looking quite wobbly, particularly as Ukraine is now carrying out long-range missile strikes on Russian energy infrastructure. And what has happened, I think there's a fair chance that Putin has panicked or has come under such enormous pressure that he has once again got on the phone to Trump and his advisors, and he has once again been able to convince them that Russia is just about to score a decisive win on the battlefield, and it is time for everyone to accept that reality. That, by the way, does not reflect the situation on the battlefield, where it's a terrible stalemate with continuing heavy losses on both sides, a disproportionate number of those losses on the Russian side, because they are the ones continuing to attack. But Ukraine is suffering terribly as well, and as we see occasionally on the news, not often enough, Russia continues to carry out indiscriminate drone and missile attacks on apartment blocks and schools in Ukraine. Now, when it comes to Trump, given the way that he is behaving, I mentioned last week the outrageous, I thought, blatant 1 kilo gold bar from Switzerland to get what they wanted. It's no longer with supposedly our most important ally to rule out that some sort of financial incentive is involved here. Either directly Russia purchasing huge amounts of Trump meme coins, or lavish promises of a Trump Tower in Moscow to go along with, Trump Towers now being built in Riyadh and Trump Towers being built in Dubai and a Trump golf course being built in Vietnam. Clearly, Donald Trump is now available to the highest bidder, and it's way past the time for Australia's decision makers to recognise that fact and start behaving accordingly. And very high on that list needs to be more support for Ukraine. As the US looks to be getting out, we should be doing more, and I believe that it's outright hypocrisy and dishonesty of the current government to say that it is standing with Ukraine and that it believes in the rules-based order, but in the last 12 months has given absolutely nothing in terms of aid to Ukraine. The government is continuing a policy of doing the minimum possible while claiming that this is some sort of policy triumph. It is not. I'll remind listeners to a couple of salient facts. It took Australia about 18 months, longer than everyone else, to reopen our embassy in Kiev. And to that, of course, can be added what I went into in as much detail as I could, what looked like the obscenely rapid destruction of our fleet of 46 Taipan helicopters. And one valid interpretation of that is that it had to occur at such speed to make sure that the helicopters could never be transferred to Ukraine, the theory being that if Ukraine was able to successfully use them, it would be a massive amount of egg on the face of the Australian Army and the Australian government. Now, I see in parallel, and a very welcome development, the Sydney Morning Herald has decided to run a campaign based or backed up by editorials about the issue of blocking the use of Russian blended petrol in the Australian domestic fuel system. And as regular listeners to these podcasts would know, that was actually something I recommended about 6 weeks ago. The government doesn't listen to me, but maybe with a major publication like the Sydney Morning Herald getting behind this, it might make a difference. Because the quick story is a legal loophole allows companies to import refined oil products, petrol and diesel, that contain a proportion of the original oil from Russia. This is because of smuggling and greed. The Russian shadow fleet of tankers delivers a load of extremely cheap oil to a refinery in, say, India or Malaysia, and it is then blended with oil from other sources, and that mixture is shipped to Australia. The estimate is that when you fill up your car at the Bowser, about 5% of what goes into your tank is Russian oil or Russian diesel. Now, the government has the power to stop this, but keeps stalling, and stalling over again, for reasons I cannot understand, since something like 80% of Australians want Ukraine to be given more support. During the last election campaign, the government made a big deal of Ukraine, using the opportunity to slam Peter Dutton for his very strange stance that Australia should not be involved in a peacekeeping mission to Ukraine and that area. I mean, I think I questioned at the time, you don't have to send combat troops. You could send a medical team or some engineers. Anyway, the government jumped onto that, and they really carried on that it was only the government that was supporting Ukraine, not the opposition, and made effective political capital out of it. It's almost as if the slogan, "Standing with Ukraine," only means standing next to Vladimir Zelensky for a photo opportunity. And if anything, the situation is getting worse, because at the recently concluded G20 meeting in South Africa, participants released a statement of support for Ukraine. This is following the US ultimatum. But there was one country that refused to sign it. So, class, time for one of our regular competitions. Which member nation of the G20 refused to sign a statement of support for Ukraine? Any answers, class? Yes, if you answered Australia, you would be correct. Why is this happening? Why is Australia doing things that benefit Russia? The answer is, I don't know. It seems hard to believe that a single member of cabinet would be pro-Russian, but the evidence suggests something like that is happening. Anyway, knowing something about how governments work, it is much more likely that this is just sheer indifference and ineptitude. No one in the government, not Foreign Minister Wong, nor Defence Minister Miles, nor the Prime Minister, can be bothered lifting a finger, because that would mean making some decisions, and Ukraine is so far away that they just don't care. Now, as it happened, very much connected with Ukraine, I attended a conference last week called MILSIS in Canberra. It's very tech-heavy. About 95% of it was way over my head. It has a lot of IT stuff, a lot of communication stuff. But there was a very interesting presentation by an Australian company called Codan, who tend to fly under the radar. I've come across them before. A high-tech company, invests heavily in research and development, have had far more success on the overseas market than they ever have had in Australia because of the ADF's natural kind of, if it's been developed in Australia, it can't be as good as something developed in the United States. So Codan has not won anything like the amount of work that I think they have deserved to win on their merits in Australia. But they are selling radios, which are part of a navigation system, to Ukraine. This is the government of Ukraine is buying them. And these radios, which are jam resistant and things like that, are being used to equip all of Ukraine's larger uncrewed aerial vehicles, I assume Flamingos and Neptunes and things like that, that are carrying out these long-range strikes on Russian energy infrastructure and having a real effect. So, Australian government, rather than sitting on your backsides doing nothing, why don't you supply those radios? Why don't you, out of your extremely large defence budget, find a few millions of dollars to really help out Ukraine and do something practical rather than just talking up what's going on? I also learnt a number of other things, talking Ukraine and people who were at the conference who knew what was going on. I learnt that Australia's Abrams main battle tanks are being used not in their intended role as main battle tanks, but as mobile artillery platforms providing indirect fire support. Because, of course, if they venture close to the front lines, they're going to be destroyed by Russian drones. Anyway, this is not a particularly useful role for a main battle tank because their main gun can only be elevated to 20 degrees above the horizon, which is well short of the 45-degree angle that would give you maximum range, or even higher angles that allow you to conduct something called plunging fire. I won't get overly technical about that. Sometimes it's a big advantage to be able to drop a shell from, an extreme angle. For example, when enemy forces are located on the far side of a steep hill. On the other hand, it's better than nothing, and because the shells are fired, I'm guessing, at supersonic speed, the enemy probably won't hear them arriving before explosions started. There are a few other snippets. A story of a Ukrainian uncrewed ground vessel vehicle that defended a position for several weeks. This was a little robotic device with a heavy machine gun that kept on going out in front of Ukrainian lines after being given more ammunition, and it managed to hold out there for quite a while until it was eventually destroyed. Future of ground warfare there being demonstrated again. Now, to switch gears a little bit for the final few minutes, I noticed that my colleague Andrew Green, treated appallingly by the ABC, but now with Seven West Media, he's acquired a dog. Well, the Green family has adopted a dog by the name of Victoria. I'll update you about that. But Andrew had a very interesting breaking story about Japan and C-3000, the general-purpose frigate Goat Rodeo, and Japan apparently having concerns about the Korean company Hanwha Ocean owning 9.9% of Austal with an option under consideration going up to 19.8%. Now, to my Japanese friends, I would suggest to them it's too early in the process for you to be getting stressed about any of that. The first task is to build the 3 frigates in Japan. And let me explain very briefly why I don't think a single Mogami frigate will ever be built in Henderson on current policy settings. This, again, gets back to the completely warped, totally secret evaluation of the bidders, and what I can repeat, I'm sure I've mentioned this before, that the evaluations of the bid from Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems did not require a single line of information about what a proposed Australian build would look like. Nothing at all. I just find it extraordinary that the department has so mishandled this to the seeming, pleasure of the government. So the way is wide open for MHI, assuming that the government finally says, oh, okay, well, can we have a firm quote from you for building, up to 8 of these frigates at Austal in the Henderson precinct? The way is open for MHI to come back perfectly legitimately and reasonably and say, oh, yes, we have looked at that, and that's going to be an extra $100 billion. As I say, perfectly legitimate, perfectly reasonable for that to happen. And as a company, you just make keeping the build at your parent yard to be the most cost-effective and attractive option as possible. But the government basically has no choice to go down that path. Now, no one in industry, Australian industry, believes that there will ever be a build at Henderson. So the government can talk itself blue in the face about all of these future jobs and future work and things like that on current policy settings. It just will not happen. Okay, that's all I've got time for this time. Hopefully, there'll be some positive developments regarding Ukraine that I can go into next time, and hopefully we will see some action from this government to back up their rhetoric about standing with Ukraine. Yeah, how about doing something practical? Goodbye for now. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia-Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.